So, okay, what if nothing you perceive around you is real, and all your senses are deceived by something that's keeping your mind imprisoned? Can you really, truly know what you think is real, genuinely is?
A prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch.
Yes, this question might have been pivotal to a certain highly successful sci-fi movie, but it is also one that people have asked themselves for hundreds and hundreds of years. Perhaps the most engaging and influential answer came from the philosophical work of Rene Descartes. So let's replace robots with a demon, take whichever pill is not a far-right dog whistle, and oh, okay, I thought these were M&Ms, but they're actually little chocolate things, so just pretend this looks like a blue pill and a red pill, okay? And let's talk about meditations on first philosophy. In 1641, Descartes published his Meditations on First Philosophy and helped to kickstart the Enlightenment, and a mighty kick it was too. The Meditations remain a keystone of modern philosophy to this day. Appealing to a learned audience, it was initially published in Latin as Meditationes de prima philosophia in qua Dei existentia et animi immortalitas demonstratur, which means meditations on first philosophy in which the existence of God and the immortality of anime are demonstrated. Yep, not only one of the greatest minds of all time, but a man of culture too. While this was neither Descartes' first publication to elucidate his ideas, nor his last, I think it's fair to say it's the most cogently explained and elegantly written of them, his ideas essentially being neatly presented to the reader in an easily understood narrative story. And if you ever try to pin down Nietzsche as he pings between different subjects, or slogged through Hegel, you might appreciate the directness and simplicity. I certainly did. Essentially, the basis of Descartes' thought system is to break reality down and then attempt to build it up again piece by piece, using only those building blocks that can be rationally proven. Now, skepticism was of course nothing new to philosophy. It was a pillar of the Platonic Academy, and the allegory of the cave is after all a similar concept of ignorantly observing a false reality. Even many years before the Academy, skeptical ideas had been explored by sophists like the gorgeous Gorgias, as well as contemporaneously by ancient Indian philosophers. It's a fairly natural place to go once thinkers begin to focus on questions like, what does it mean to exist, and how do I actually know what I know, to go all the way to, you know what, I can't actually prove anything exists. And this is where Descartes begins. He, or at least his narrator character, reflects on how nothing our senses tell us can be trusted. Departing from Aristotelian answers to these doubts, he cannot accept that the senses are a reliable medium by which we come to know the world. After all, our senses are constantly deceiving us. You know, we think we hear spooky things on dark nights when there was nothing to be heard. We imagine things that aren't there, or think we've seen things that we haven't. Just a few days ago, I woke up and looked at my security camera, and in my sleep-addled state, I was convinced that my garden shed was the face of an old man.
Ooh, there he is, the creepy old man.
So yeah, I see his point. Taste, touch, smell, balance, whatever other sense you can think of, they can get it wrong sometimes. A helicopter. Stop flying helicopters while I'm filming! Hallucinations are a thing, as are dreams that we're convinced are real. And even if you say, okay, my senses can be wrong momentarily, but I figure it out soon after. Let's go back to the Matrix idea. Yep. How do we know, really know, beyond any doubt at all, that there isn't a powerful demon that's holding us in a state of constant hallucination, that we have no way of knowing about and no capacity to think is unrealistic. In such a world, even what we think of as mathematical truths could be totally wrong, because all the demon would have to do would be to manipulate our idea of correct mathematics, and we'd have no way of knowing that we were mistaken. A posteriori knowledge, that is, knowledge that has been inferred from observation or the information given by the senses, is to be rejected. Only a priori knowledge that arrived at from purely logical processes should be accepted. And if everything can be doubted, doesn't that leave precisely nothing? Descartes' most well-known flash of brilliance is his wonderfully elegant solution to this absolute dismantling of reality. When every single way we interact with the world around us is dubious, there is one fact that remains self-evidently true. Cogito ergo sum. J'y pense, donc j'y suis. I think, therefore I am. Nailed it. Really though, it's an inspired thought. If our senses can't be trusted, there's one thing we can perceive without needing to trust them. The thing that's trying to do the sensing is still there. For there to be thoughts of what is real, the thinking thing must exist. And if that seems obvious to you, that's thanks to centuries of this idea being at the core of modern philosophy. And it's just such a superb response to the question of whether anything at all can be demonstrated beyond doubt to exist. This can be. Marvellous idea, really. Now, of course, it is an incredibly limited revelation. Just because I now have self-evident proof that I exist doesn't mean I have any reason to think that any of you do. I have no evidence whatsoever that the same process is going on anywhere else, that you are thinking too. Believing that only you exist is called solipsism, and even if that's not what you think the truth is, can you prove that it's not the case? Also, later philosophers have called into question whether the concept of I is really demonstrated in I think, therefore I am. What is this I without any frame of reference? Can we really go beyond, there is thinking going on? Can we prove that what we think of as I is a single entity and not, for example, the result of numerous versions of me simultaneously and collaboratively existing to give me consciousness? Or that the existence of this I continues through time rather than being constantly destroyed and reborn as part of this thinking process? Well, perhaps not, but this first step brings a tiny pinpoint of certainty to existence, which is undoubtedly an incredible achievement. Descartes has managed to prove something rather than absolute nothingness, which is, where Gorgias left us. And of course, Descartes does actually seek to define what he means by I, by the self. He defines this I as a thinking thing, a doubting thing, a thing that can understand and imagine and have a conception of what senses are, even if those senses then can't be trusted. If there is thinking, something must be thinking, and that thing is I. Whether the existence of thinking is adequate evidence for a thing that is doing the thinking that can then be thought of as I is somewhat up to the reader to decide to this very day. Nonetheless, this is where Descartes begins to rebuild his reality. Another philosophical idea is that things exist independently of the perceiver in their purest form, what Kant later called the noumenon. But how to define such things? By their qualities? And Descartes thinks of wax. When it's cold, it's solid, and you can make a candle. When it's hot, it can be soft, or even a liquid that you can use to seal an envelope. The colour often completely changes during this process too. So what then are the qualities of wax? We can extend this same idea to a number of things. Are water, ice, and steam all the same object? Why not? No, the idea of there existing perfect forms of things that are unaltered by human perception doesn't do it for Descartes. I mean, yes, they might exist, but there isn't any a priori proof of that. Except Descartes thinks one thing, one concept in his mind that isn't like wax or ice or another person. And that, thought Descartes, coming to his second extremely influential, albeit less influential than the first one, conclusion, is the concept of God. Excellent sentence construction there. Let's stop a moment while we're still on a high note and consider this man, Rene Descartes, who accomplished so much while also managing to maintain such lush and voluminous hair. Descartes was born in the small commune of Descartes in modern-day Indre-et-Loire, en France. Ah yes, my glorious French pronunciation is back once again. Of course, it wasn't called Descartes at the time, they renamed it for him. It was called at the time La Haye. He was born in 1596, his mother sadly dying soon after giving birth to him. And with his father being a busy jurist, Rene was largely raised by his grandmother. He was a sickly child, but studied hard, at one point aspiring to be a military engineer. He began writing his philosophical ideas in the late 1620s and moved to Holland, though he was cautious about publishing. Galileo having been executed by the Inquisition in 1633, the first iterations of the concepts explored in the Meditations were printed as Discourse on the Method, an introduction to 3 largely mathematical essays, including La Géométrie, which laid out the principles of Cartesian geometry. The Meditations were published in 1641, proving controversial but securing Descartes' fame. In 1649, the Queen of Sweden invited him to her court as a tutor, which is where he died of pneumonia the next year, giving rise to some inevitable conspiracy theories about assassination. But thus ended the life of a brilliant man whose legacy totally shaped our conception of what modern philosophy is and seeks to achieve. On that note, let's go back and deal with the rest of what Descartes tried to prove in his Meditations. Now up to here, I think Descartes has been utterly brilliant. Well, he remains utterly brilliant, however the rest of his philosophical system goes. Let's not forget that as well as being the father of modern philosophy, he was also giving the world revolutionary ideas in mathematics too. But the fact is that to get from proving his own existence to proving that everything exists as he knows it to his satisfaction, and that there is no evil demon just constantly deceiving him, Descartes turns to belief in God. Not just faith, mind you. What made the system a little risky with the Inquisition still running about is that Descartes sets out to show that God is as self-evidently true as his own thinking being is. Indeed, the remaining 2/3 of the book are devoted to this endeavour and its ramifications. Descartes, whose name I am pronouncing about 20 different ways in this video, relies mostly on a version of the Ontological Argument, which dates back to St. Anselm and his 11th century proslogion. So boiled down, the argument is this: God is by definition the perfect being. Part of being perfect is existing. So if I imagine anything imperfect, i.e. something that doesn't exist, well, that's just not God anymore. I'm just imagining something else that isn't God. So to think of God is to think of the perfect being, so he must exist. Gotcha. Descartes rather cheekily makes his own variation on this idea, and then later in the book references the ontological argument in its more traditional form as though it's backing up his logic in a complementary way, rather than just saying the same sort of thing slightly differently. Cheeky Descartes. So his custom version is something like this. I exist and I have inside my mind thoughts of the perfect being, which is God. And in the leap of logic I personally think is the major flaw here, the idea of God's perfection could not originate from any source but a perfect one, i.e. from a perfect God. That's just how transcendently perfect he is. Descartes then spends some time eliminating some other options for why he might exist, like that he as a thinking thing created himself, or that he has simply existed forever and will go on existing for all of eternity, mostly kind of hand-waving away each possibility with other assertions that aren't necessarily entirely logical. So for example, he says if he created himself, he would have made himself a perfect being, and that he intrinsically knows that he is a dependent being, so he must be depending on some other higher power. Neither of which assertions really fit his own rules of a priori knowledge. But ultimately, he concludes that the creator must have been a perfect being, i.e. must have been God. If this sounds somewhat less like a logical progression than those brilliant initial conclusions, well, yeah. And if you think you could substitute God in this argument for the flying spaghetti monster, as long as it's a perfect flying spaghetti monster, yes. Though arguably that doesn't in any way ruin the concept, it just gives God a different, more noodly name and appearance. But Descartes' conclusion, or that of the narrator figure, relies on him having within him a conception of a perfect being, which then self-evidently proves that this being exists. To his credit, Descartes published this work with many responses from other leading minds of the time, and several of them, especially the theologians, questioned whether the mortal mind truly can have an adequate conception of a perfect being, and of course whether having that conception necessarily means that this perfect being must exist. Unfortunately, Descartes doesn't really have strong answers for any of these objections, and mostly he just restates his claim, if he even responds. With this assurance of God in mind, though, it's mostly easy for Descartes to build up reality again. Descartes starts with mathematical truths, which is a little bit of an odd place to begin, given that we established that an omnipotent being could convince the thinker that mathematical truths were objectively true even if they weren't, so a sufficiently powerful demon could too. The point here is that even if the thinker is deluded, mathematical truths remain constant regardless of the thinker's opinion or knowledge. But here he doesn't really deal with the possibility that he could be manipulated into thinking this is the truth by his hypothetical demon. And I guess it doesn't really matter because, you know, he's going to use God anyway. Because our thinker believes that other things exist, God must have created him to believe in them. And because God is good, and anything that would be deceiving the thinker would not be God, then everything else must exist. And that of course includes the thinker's body. You know, he may simply be a ghost in the machine, but the machine must necessarily exist because he has a conception of it, and omnibenevolent God is rationally ensuring that whatever he's believing in actually exists. That none of this really dispels the possibility that the demon we started with exists, but the thinker's deception is in some way part of God's benevolent plan in a way the thinker just simply doesn't comprehend. Here it's not dealt with. So thus, Descartes, at least to his own satisfaction, came to the conclusion that reality was rationally and empirically provable. As we've seen, much of the later part of his method is questionable at best, and even at the time it was, you know, widely objected to. But those first two meditations, dismantling everything and then with absolute rationality, finding one pinpoint of absolute certainty, that was a moment of undeniable brilliance. And this line of thinking of how we know we exist and how we know the objects around us are real has been central to Western philosophy ever since, and well, before that too. And though it doesn't necessarily begin with Descartes, this line of thinking of how we know we exist and how we know the objects around us are real has remained central to Western philosophy ever since, from existentialism to logical positivism. People tend to think of philosophers as having these immensely deep, dense, impenetrable thoughts, and yes, it can be extremely hard to get to grips with what your Kierkegaards or Schopenhauers are actually trying to convey, but generally they are making complex answers to very simple, fundamental questions. It's not so much why are we here as how do we know we're here? How do we know this stuff is here? And how do we know we're not just alone and existing without purpose in an infinite, godless, uncaring universe? Okay, well, we'll deal with nihilism another day. That's all for now. Please leave a comment to let me know what you thought of good old Mr. Ergo Sum himself, and I will see you again next time. Goodbye!